We did the trek to Everest Base Camp. Shortly after that, my mother-in-law had visited us. And just in the conversation, something came up about, imagine if you climbed Mount Everest. And the children said to my husband, Dad, what flag would you plant if you climbed Mount Everest? And he said, without blinking an eyelid, he said, it'll be both the flags.
That was Indian-born, now Irish resident, novelist Cauvery Madhavan. And my name is Martin Nutty.
And I'm John Lee. Welcome to another Global Irish Nation conversation here on Irish Stew. Today's episode of Irish Stew is sponsored by Ogham Art, where you can find original prints, jewelry, home decor, and custom gifts featuring Ogham, the first written form of the Irish language. Visit oghamart.com, and that's OGHAMART.com, and listeners can save 20% at oghamart.com using coupon code IRISHSTEW. That's OGHAMART.com. Well, welcome to this episode of Irish Stew, and we're very happy to bring in really another continent into our discussion today, the subcontinent. And to tee that up, Martin, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Hey, John, great to be back on the stew again, and I'm delighted to introduce our new guest, Cauvery Madhavan, who is been resident in Ireland since 1987 and is best known as a writer of 3 novels, but she also practices journalism, I believe, periodically writing articles for the Irish Times, amongst a number of other newspapers and magazines. Cauvery, as I mentioned, has published 3 books. Original book was published in 2001 with the compelling title Paddy Indian. And then she followed it a couple of years later with another book called The Uncoupling. And most recently, she's published The Tainted, which has gotten outstanding reviews. And so we want to talk with Cauvery about her experience. She's been living in Ireland, as I mentioned, for over 30 years. She's a member of the Indian community, which I believe is about 90,000 people strong thereabouts in Ireland, mostly concentrated in Dublin, but in other parts of the country. And we also want to talk about her book and the themes that it reveals and how that impacts our global Irish conversation.
And, that's a good intro because, Cauvery, I believe you first based yourself in Sligo, and that's Yeats country. And from another recording we heard of you, we know there's a Yeats poem that really resonated with you, and 2 lines in particular to help us frame up The Tainted.
Yes, that's right. Thank you so much, Martin and John, for that wonderful introduction. I'm so happy to be with you guys on this podcast, Irish Stew. Yes, as you said, John, those 2 lines from the poem "An Irish Airman Foresees His Death" were very kind of. It's very poignant and very relevant to the book, and really triggered me to actually get going with it.
Let me do it for you because I kind of sprung this on you. Those that I fight, I do not hate. Those that I guard, I do not love. And you said that was really a 2-sentence tagline for your book in a way.
Absolutely, John. I mean, you read the book, and you can see it for yourself. I think the whole of the Irish experience in of being part of the colonizing British, being part of the empire, being part of the colonizers, is literally those 2 lines, and it's the strangest thing, isn't it? That Irish people were colonized by the same people that they helped to colonize others, not just in India. Now they Irish people sort of helped and aided and worked for the empire in other parts of the world as well.
A lot of conflicted feelings on many levels throughout your book and throughout these experiences we're talking about. People doing things that they needed to do to survive, and some regrets, some benefits, but interesting series of conflicts.
Yeah, I mean, I think definitely it was a case of doing it because there weren't many other options for young Irishmen at that, over the period of 300 years. In fact, with a lot of people who went, educated people who went to serve in the empire, a lot of them were second, third, fourth, fifth sons who had no chance of an inheritance, and they headed off to make their fortune, in different parts of the world. And in fact, the strange thing is that in the end, they were the ones who didn't inherit, but actually they were the ones who came back much better off than many of the people who inherited, because the inheritances here weren't always sort of valuable. There sometimes were millstones around people's necks. So Irish people did really well, and not just in the military field. They were literally Irish men in every aspect of running the empire. Whether it was the railways, whether they were in customs, whether they were, in mapping, geographers, they could have been literally in any, some of them in the jute trade, some of them were in the tea industry, a lot of them were just in pure administration, and it's a little known fact. Not many people know that the exams for the British civil service in India, for the Indian civil service, the exams, the competitive exam, from the 1800s, they were held there were exam centers in Cork and in Belfast and Dublin. So I mean, Irish people are doing this in a very kind of routine, legitimate, way for many, many years, many decades. And there were several Irish women who went as well, not just as spouses, but several of them went as nurses, as teachers. Then, of course, there were the religious as well who went and who had a huge influence, in the Indian subcontinent.
Cauvery, I saw or maybe read where you remarked about your early childhood actually being introduced to Yeats by Irish nuns even before you went to Ireland. And I wanted to just kind of throw back a little bit to kind of get a sense of your, origin story and how you actually fetched up in Ireland. So can you play that out a little for us?
Yeah, I'd love to. My father was an army officer, so I'm an army brat, as people would call themselves nowadays. And because of my father's job, because of him being in the army, we traveled a lot around India wherever the regiment went. The families went along. So I have attended several schools. I actually went to 13 schools. Would you believe it? Which is quite a huge number of schools for any child to go to, and every single one of them was run by Irish nuns. It just most peculiar, but that's just the way it worked out. And nuns in India, the Irish nuns in India had always had very good libraries in the school, and one of the features of getting a convent education was this access to libraries, and also to sport, to music, apart from the curriculum. So, and a convent education was anyway, very much a desired thing for a child. So anyway, I was educated by Irish nuns. I, in fact, even went to my university college was run by nuns. Would you believe it? It's quite incredible. And I never, ever, ever dreamt that I would come to Ireland. So when I got married, my husband came to Ireland as a junior doctor, looking to get his FRCS, the letters behind his name. And I followed. I came as an accompanying spouse, and we just never went back to India. We just loved Ireland. We made our life here, and we're very happy. Very happy. It's home now for us.
From what I understood, you guys fetched up first of all in Sligo.
That's right.
Tell me a little bit about the cultural shock, the climatic shock. How did it meet your expectations, or?
Oh my God, no. I think it dashed all my expectations, actually, because I think growing up, the West was one monolith for young teenagers in India. You would never differentiate between the UK and Ireland and the US. I mean, it was all just the West, So when I was getting ready to come here, we had this notion that we were going to be going into a den of just sex, drugs, rock and roll. So the culture shock was very, very much in reverse, actually, very much in reverse. We never expected Ireland, and of course Sligo was twice as conservative as the rest of the country. So it was a culture shock in reverse. That's what I'd say.
Cauvery, I think for Americans of my generation, that's how they looked at India: sex, drugs, and rock and roll. So it just shows you we have our wishes and desires. But
that's right. Oh gosh, that Bhagwan Rajneesh. Oh my God, yeah.
From what I understand, you actually started off as a copywriter in India before you got married, correct?
Yeah.
Was the plan when you fetched up into Ireland, like, okay, I'm in Ireland now, so I might as well find some other way of using my writing talent? Was the idea to, write the great novel? So obviously you arrive in Ireland in 1987, publish your first book in 2001. So what happened on the in-between?
Yeah, it was a funny old thing, Martin, because in 1986, when you came as an accompanying spouse, there was no question of getting a working visa. So I knew from the start that was going to be a problem. And so basically, I actually just took a complete career break and I devoted myself to reading. Would you believe it? That's what I did. I did, because we didn't have children for the first 5 years. So I became a voracious reader. I mean, I already was a voracious reader. I just sort of started consuming Irish books in massive quantities. I just loved. I loved those years when we had no children, and I could do what I wanted with my time. And of course, I love my children dearly. I don't want anybody to think that I don't that I didn't welcome my children. We when they did arrive, 5 years on, we were just delighted. But those first 5 years were so formative for me from an Irish point of view, because that's in those 5 years is when I absorbed a good bit of the culture, and I got a great insight. I used to listen to a lot of radio, a lot of Gay Byrne. I don't know whether I'm sure lots of American Irish American people would know, or in fact all Irish American people would know Gay Byrne. And so listening to a lot of radio, daytime radio, gave me a real insight into the Irish psyche.
Cauvery, did a difference? Now, I can kind of look at this because I'm an American, and when I travel to Ireland, this is something I feel. Martin's Irish, so he may not feel this, but did you feel like a different sense of the language just kind of seeping into your pores as you were hearing people speak and reading the way Irish writers write?
Yeah, I mean, I think more from just colloquial speech, not from reading or from or even from listening to the radio or anything, but actually just from neighbors, from friends, going to a shop. And we didn't go to India for 2 years after we came. I mean, the first time we visited was after 2 years. And I must say that it was only when we went back to India, people would say, like, what are you, what is that? What does that even mean? When you say, I'm grand, like if somebody asks you will you have a cup of tea? And you say, oh, I'm grand. What does it mean? So a lot of Irishisms crept into our speech and into our way of thinking as well, without us even realizing it. It's amazing how, by osmosis, really, you absorb a language and its idioms and, its strange inflections and, double meanings and stuff like that.
Despite my accent, even 37 years or whatever it is, 38 years now since I left Ireland, my Hiberno English does tend to crop up periodically and confuse Americans over this side of the Atlantic. But on the podcast, we're kind of really interested in identity. So you, like me, we kind of share something in common. We spent, large portions of our lives living in different places. I now would answer to an identity of Irish American. How do you answer that question? Are you Hiberno-Indian, Indo-Irish, or how do you see that, and where do you put the dash?
Yeah, it's a really, really difficult, not a difficult question to answer, but it's a huge difficulty in my own brain. And I think that happens a lot, don't you think, Martin, with first generation immigrants? This feeling of not completely belonging to either place. Because I know very often, even my absolute best friend, who's my next door neighbor as well, she would say, she might introduce me to somebody and say, "Oh, this is my Indian friend," and I mean, it doesn't bother me, but yet the fact that I notice it, obviously, then it does it. There's something in it that doesn't sort of sit right with me, and then when we go back to India, when we visit India, it's very difficult then, when you're giving an opinion and people turn around and say, "Sure, what would you know? You're not Indian, you haven't been around for 35 years. What would you know?" You and very often people would say, "Oh, yeah, sure, you're not Indian. You've become Irish." So it's very hard. And I'll tell you a very interesting thing happened to us. My husband and myself, we had gone to Everest Base Camp. We did the trek to Everest Base Camp, and shortly after that, my mother-in-law had visited us, and just in the conversation, and something came up about, imagine if you climbed Mount Everest, and the children said to my husband, "Oh, Dad, what flag would you put up? What flag would you plant if you climbed Mount Everest?" And he said, without blinking an eyelid, he said, "Oh, it'll be both the flags." And my mother-in-law took such exception to that. And actually, the children got so upset that she took such exception. There's a lot to deal with when you're first generation immigrant. There's a lot to deal with from your home place as well as from your new home.
Cauvery, my wife is from Italy, so I kind of have this experience secondhand through her. And I know when she goes back, they call her the Americanina, and they comment on her American accent while she speaks Italian. These are, as Martin said, we're really interested in exploring these topics of what we call the emerging global Irish identity. So this is why it's so great to talk to you, because you really are exploring a lot of these things, also an Indian identity as well. But you're really exploring these topics deeply in the Tainted, and maybe this is a good time to get into the book. What was the origin? We talked about your origin story. What was the origin story of this book? You had a pretty long lead time. You obviously did intensive research.
Yeah.
What made you hit go on this project?
Yeah, so I stumbled across the story completely accidentally, John, and it was at an event in the Irish Embassy. I'm sorry, in the Indian Embassy in Dublin, and I overheard a conversation about a mutiny that had taken place in India of the Connaught Rangers, and never having heard of it before. I didn't even know at that stage that there were Irish regiments ever in India. Because coming from India, you just club them all into the one umbrella of English. Because as far as India was concerned, we were ruled by the English, and everybody who came as part of that ruling class were English. So for me, it was a huge surprise, and of course, I was really intrigued. Immediately, the very next day, started looking it up, and I knew very quickly that I had a story. But what I didn't, when I started the book, when I started the research for the book, and in fact, I had actually started writing it, the plan was to write the story of the mutiny and the aftermath of what happened to, aftermath of the mutiny and what happened to the mutineers when they came back to Ireland and how badly they were treated and how they were ostracized. But within the first 2 or 3 chapters, I knew that this book was not going to be about the mutiny alone, that it was going to be about this massive number of children that Irishmen left behind in India. And really, it's an untold. Who in Ireland would know that there are, hundreds of thousands, not thousands, but the community of Anglo-Indians, as they're called. um, they have their paternal links are to Ireland, to Wales, Scotland, and England. Where all the soldiers and the majority of the of the ruling class that were present in India at that time. So it was such a revelation to think that that's why there's so many people in India with Irish surnames that you would never I never even would have made the connection. It's one of those things you grow up with so many Anglo-Indians like I did. I had Anglo-Indian friends right through my schooling years, and never dreamt that any of them might have an Irish connection. So for me, very quickly, I realized that the story actually lay, in the fact that there was a huge Indo-Irish community that has never been acknowledged. And funnily enough, it's not that community has been looking to be acknowledged as Irish either. They have scattered to various parts of the world. A majority of them, of course, are still in India, but a huge number of them, just moved away to other parts of the world, and they hid their Indian, Indianness or Indian blood or their Indian genes, because it was the only way they could get on in life outside India. If they migrated to Australia or to Canada, or to England for that matter. One of the prime examples is I'm having a mental blank here now. The famous English singer. Very, very famous from the 60s. He's like the darling of he's like a national icon in England, in the UK.
Cliff Richard.
Cliff Richard.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, now Cliff Richard is an Anglo-Indian, but in the late 50s and early 60s, when his family and he came to the UK, if there was even a whiff of Indian blood, he would never have got the recording contracts. And that remained a secret for so long. I don't think he deliberately kept it a secret, but he never spoke of the fact that he was of mixed race. And now you tell any English person now that Cliff Richard was half Indian, who would believe it?
I'm mindful of not revealing too much about the book because I loved it and I want everybody else to have the opportunity to love it. So I'm going to kind of pull out some of what I think thematically is interesting to me and, our discussion. So what you're kind of alluding to is this identity issue within India itself. What's amusing, obviously, as an Irish person that grew up in Ireland, was the fact that simply Irish people, let's say mixed race people in India, were referred to as, Anglo-Indian.
Yes. Yeah.
But, people in Ireland would never have referred to themselves as Anglo at all. So they're tossed into this bucket right away.
Yeah.
Now, admittedly, these Irish people are there to support, let's say, the imperial ambitions
That's right.
of England. And you kind of have to think to some degree there's some buy-in there, but not always. And that seems to come out a lot in the book. There are, all these shades of identity. So we have, for example, the Anglo-Irish commander of in your book, you call them the Kildare Rangers, which I guess reads, the Connaught Rangers. He's an Anglo-Irishman, meaning he's Protestant. He kind of identifies more as English, even though he's probably lived in Ireland. But the reality is that if he goes to England, he'll be treated somewhat as slightly second class, right?
Definitely.
Because he's not really fully English.
Yeah.
And this is playing out multiple times in your book in different ways. You have, obviously, the case that, one of the central characters, Rose Toomey, who is the daughter of an Anglo-Indian whose father is Irish. She refers to herself basically as Irish.
Yeah.
She's never been to Ireland. She has a fantasy, of going back home which is, she's young and probably doesn't really understand, maybe that's not the best idea. But this it permeates the book, and people are just are splitting hairs all the time. The Anglo-Indians, and correct me if I'm wrong, kind of see themselves as a step above full Indian-blooded people.
Yes.
And every bit as good as English people.
Yeah.
But the English certainly don't see that.
No, not at all. Not at all. I mean, Martin, till the 70s, Anglo-Indians did not want to, well, I wouldn't say did not want to, but, they felt that they were separate and different. And I think after the 80s, after the mid 80s, a lot of the older generation obviously had passed on, and the younger generation had a completely different view. They felt, no, we're just Indian. We're just one of the many hundreds and hundreds of different communities and kinds of people, race, tribes in India. So the way Anglo-Indians look upon themselves today is completely different. In 30 years, there's been a sea change. Completely, and not only in the way Anglo-Indians look at themselves, but also the way Indians, the majority Indians, who are not of mixed blood, would look upon Anglo-Indians. People have now. I'll give you an example, Martin. When my father was first commissioned as an officer, I remember he told me that when he was first commissioned, one of the things that young officers were told that they were never allowed. It was, Anglo-Indian girls were persona non grata in an officer's mess. Can you imagine, to be told you cannot bring an Anglo-Indian woman with you into the officer's mess?
Because they're seen as tainted goods to some degree, which is obviously consistent with your book title, right?
And they were seen as girls who were fast, who were just looking for, they just want to make a good marriage. And it was such an unfair reputation.
Well, you bring it out really well, Cauvery. You say, can you imagine it? After reading your book, I can absolutely imagine it. And I also was, you took a pretty unflinching look at color throughout the book, the color of people. Yeah. And the sort of the way the kind of, it's another sort of reference point. It's another indicator of status to your character, who would always be under an umbrella because she didn't want her skin to darken. Yeah. Color keeps coming up throughout the book, and it sounds like it's a dynamic that plays out throughout India. And I just wonder if you'd comment on that, and then also once you came to Ireland, how did that look to you?
Yeah, God, John, I mean, literally, I could rant forever, because there is no country that is more color conscious than India. It is the scourge of India, this color consciousness, that if you're fair, you are beautiful. If you're dark, you're not beautiful. So it's, that theme of color, I never wrote it purposely into the book. I was not conscious of writing it, but it just crept in because, I was trying to portray India as realistically as possible. And that is exactly how India is, even to this day, very, very color conscious.
And Cauvery, I was just, I know there's a whole other topic here that you don't really go into, and it's something a Westerner just struggles to understand, like a caste system. Yeah. But in this gradation of color, as the sort of the lighter you are, the higher you are, was that in any sense, when the Anglos came over, they were the whitest, yes. The whitest you could be. Did this have this sort of allow an acceptance mentally that okay, this is they're even whiter than we are,
Yeah, you see, they were the first 2 or 3 generations of Anglo-Indians would have been quite fair, But as actually one of my characters says in the book, the blood gets diluted, the color gets diluted as the years go by, as the generations go by. So, the Anglo-Indians today would not be as fair as they would have been, in the first 2 or 3 generations, because obviously they've intermarried into Indian communities and they've intermarried amongst other Anglo-Indians.
How about the English themselves when they came over? Was their whiteness like a mark of superiority at some level?
Yeah, absolutely. That was, it was all kind of, that was the big, the ruling class were also fair. It also sat with the Indian ruling class as well. In the Indian princely states, would, especially in North India, they would have been very, very fair. And even the caste, the way the caste divisions work, the upper castes have traditionally been fairer than the lower castes. And a lot of it is to just do with, the lower caste being sort of working very hard in, outdoor manual labor. And of course, apart from that, John and Martin, there are two different kinds of races in India. We have the Aryan race, who are populate the north, and then we have the Dravidian, the Dravidian darker skinned people in the south. So even it's so complicated. Even amongst the higher caste in India, people could be dark. But on the whole, fair is good, dark is bad. And that has been, for millennia and hasn't changed, unfortunately.
You're talking too about the complexity that lies within India. Simply the scale for many people is difficult to understand. We're talking about a country with 1.3 billion people, enormous scale. Going from the Himalayas all the way down to basically the tip of India, just north of Sri Lanka, for example. That complexity falls away, I would think, for you as an immigrant to Ireland. Now you're just lumped into some general category of Indian. You're not Southern Indian, you're not, you're just Indian. And so what complexity do you find yourself having to explain frequently by our very limited understanding of India and people from India? What are the biggest challenges as a person of color, as they say, or this side of the world, living in Ireland in terms of explaining the whole Indian experience?
Yeah, I have to say now, I am actually very forgiving of somebody who might look at me and say, "Are you from Pakistan? Are you Pakistani?" Or if I were a Pakistani, being told, "Are you Indian?" And there's such an animosity between the two countries. Now, I have the best of some of my best friends are Pakistanis, and I find it's quite ironic that the minute Indians and Pakistanis leave their countries and come abroad, they become best friends. It just goes to show that the whole thing is so politically, stirred up. But to answer your question, Martin, when we first came to Ireland, I didn't know, I didn't know the massive ramifications of saying to somebody in the north, "Oh, but you're English," saying to another nationalist, "Oh, you're English." When I first came, 35 years ago, I am very forgiving of Irish people when they mistake, or when they don't know the nuances, because you don't know the nuances unless you live in that country or you maybe have a good friend. So I am very forgiving, because I made the same mistakes.
What's the most eye-rolling question that you get asked over and over again? Let's put it out on the table here.
Okay, I suppose the one that I don't eye roll, because I always think that, sure, how would anybody know? But the question that I get asked most is, "You speak really good English. Where did you learn?" It's very hard to explain. It's hard to explain, but yet the minute you explain it, people just say, "Oh gosh, never even knew that." So I'm always happy to explain it. My father and mother come from two completely different parts of India. They don't share a language in common. And so the only common language they had was English. So, they spoke to each other in English, and I grew up speaking English. I dream in English.
And English is an official language, at least in parts of
Yes.
India, isn't that? Yeah.
Oh, sure it is. Because, I mean, if you look at a note, a bank note from India, the denomination, it's written in English and then in Hindi.
Right.
And then in the middle of the note, on one side the denomination is written in 16 different languages, and then 16 different languages on the other side. So that's the 32 recognized national languages, and there's like 300 and God knows how many dialects and other languages. So, I mean, the languages there are hundreds and hundreds of languages in India.
So I thought Ireland was complicated with 2 languages, Martin.
Yeah, just pivoting back, Cauvery, to the whole, let's call them Indo-Irish community, to distinguish from, the Anglo-Indians.
Yeah.
Were you aware of people, with these odd Irish names, would they have cropped up in your day-to-day? I'm guessing a lot of them congregated around the major cities. Like you grew up in, I think, predominantly in Chennai, correct?
Yeah. There are pockets of Anglo-Indians. Sorry, are you talking about the Indo-Irish? Are you talking about?
Yeah, I'm talking about the, I recognize they're all lumped into one category, Anglo-Indian, but there's this subset that are obviously Irish.
Yeah. So they would actually be literally spread around the exact same places as other Anglo-Indians would have been, So they congregated in a couple of cities, I can tell you straight away. One was Chennai. Massive Anglo-Indian community in Chennai with lots of people of Irish parentage. In Bangalore, huge Anglo-Irish Anglo-Indian community in Bangalore. Calcutta and Kanpur, where that big massacre took place. Where they were during the revolution.
Amritsar. Yeah.
No. During the 1857 revolution. The mutiny, the Great Indian Mutiny. A lot of English. When I say English, now I'm again clubbing everybody together. Were actually murdered, were killed in Kanpur. They were dumped into a well. It's quite a famous story. And in fact, the battle cry for a couple of the regiments after that was "Remember Kanpur." Because so many women and children were mercilessly killed during that mutiny. There were atrocities on all sides, obviously. So Calcutta, Bangalore, Chennai would have massive concentrations of Anglo-Indian people.
Well, Cauvery, let's go back into the book a little bit. The Tainted, it's an epic story. I think if my math is right, it covers about 60 years of history. Yeah. Characters kind of, we see them at various stages. We see family members, we see fathers, we see daughters play out over this really nicely woven tapestry of a story, and very atmospheric. Great sense of where you were and what it felt like, the heat and what it's the scent of the flowers, the scent of the jasmine. And I'd like to kind of focus on just quickly on 2 aspects of what you were doing with the writing: the imagery and the sense of music that pervades the story. And the imagery, I know from an earlier video I saw where you talked about, your kind of how you researched the imagery that you used in the story, and particularly the centrality of both a painter and a photographer in the story.
Yeah. I suppose it started off as a device. I had to have a reason why this man was going to go back to this obscure place in India. Why would an Irishman, in the 80s want to go back to this obscure, tiny little hill station, in the middle of nowhere in India? And so it was just a tool. But then, I then had to obviously give him a story, and and then of course then his grandfather had to be a painter, and so it kind of was like a backward. I had to work backwards a little bit, but once I knew why he was going, then it was fine. Then I was able to just just move on, and I actually really it sounds really mad, but I actually love all the characters in the book very, very much. I invested a lot into them, I really did. And I actually particularly liked Richard. And it's so funny. I don't want to give away the story, but Richard and Mohan, the other character, both are vying for one particular woman's affections, and I like both the characters so much. I really didn't know who I was going to give her to, till almost till the very end.
Well, we won't let that away.
Yeah.
We won't give that out. And also, that idea of like the painter, it's such surprising that somebody, the invader would also be this artistic sensibility of a painter. And then Richard comes back and he's a photographer, so it's kind of a modern update,
Yeah.
but still.
Yeah.
And then in terms of music, there's a lot of music. Particularly, there's a phonograph. That's a very critical element at one point.
Yeah.
And then there's the piano, and anything along those lines. The idea of adding sound, the sound of music, really to your book.
Yeah, and that literally came out of knowing Anglo-Indians as I do, because I had lots and lots of Anglo-Indian friends in school, and their whole families, would have all been very musical, and playing the piano was such a, playing the guitar was a very, very Anglo-Indian thing. And if you went into any five-star hotel and there was a piano bar, or there was you went into a restaurant and there was somebody playing piano quietly in the corner, you could bet your bottom dollar it was going to be an Anglo-Indian. So, there's no question of not having a piano in a story about Anglo-Indians. They're very, very musical people, very musical people.
And on the theme of music, we're gonna bring in some music, which we haven't done on Irish Stew before. And maybe a couple of weeks ago, I was listening to WNYC here in New York, a great show called New Sounds, and they were playing some music that sounded quite Irish to me, but it was different. I said, that's cool, they're playing Irish music, but what's different about this music? And as they played it, it became Indian music. And I looked up the artist, Nirmala Rajasekar, if I'm saying her name correctly, from your own city of Chennai. Yes. And she plays, and I should have asked you for the pronunciation, but it plays the veena.
Veena,
Veena is to Western eyes and ears, it's a sitar-like instrument. And she recorded a well-known piece of Irish music referred to as Mary O'Neill or Caroline's Favorite Jig. So we're going to play a little bit of this, and we'll probably play the rest of it as we end up the episode.
Fantastic.
Thing that kind of pops out to me in terms of, let's say, the lifestyle, if you will, of those that were part of the Raj was food and service. So we have English people and Irish people, moving over to India, and all of a sudden they live a lifestyle with a retinue of helpers. Yeah. It would have been very different than their experience in Ireland.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And of course, food, especially in England, I believe the number one cuisine in England is actually Indian food. Now.
Yeah, yeah.
I'm kind of curious what your experience was in Ireland, fetching up in Sligo. How did you manage your food situation there in 1987? I can think it might have been a bit of a shock to the system.
It really was, because it was very difficult to get any ingredients. Like, it's difficult to even imagine. Nowadays in Ireland, the local petrol station has got would have would stock spices. So it's very hard to imagine what it was like in Sligo, with literally nothing available. So we were only 5 Indian families, in Sligo at that time, and there were 3 bachelors who were Pakistani. So between the 8 of us, anybody going down to Dublin, like literally, it was the done thing. If you were going to Dublin, if you were making a trip to Dublin, you rang around or you went to each person's house and checked, what do you want? Do I bring you this? Will I bring you that? And then whoever was going would do a massive big shop for as much as they could and bring it back. So that's how we coped for a few years. But I mean, very quickly, very, very quickly, the country just completely changed. And, from food that was so stodgy in the 1980s, I mean, Irish food is now just sensational. You can get sort of absolutely amazing cuisine from all parts of the world, fusion food as well. And it's just fantastic.
I was doing some research, and I found the evidence of an Indian restaurant in Dublin at about the time of the Easter Rising. Gosh. And that came from a book I read called Irish Days, Indian Memories, about V.V. Geary, the eventual president of India, and his days as a student in Ireland. And what I found out was there was quite an influx of Indian students, particularly in law, coming into Ireland at this time, and finding a bit of a warmer welcome in Ireland than they had found in England. I'll just say, to keep things simple, maybe less racist reception, and also a common cause with the burgeoning independence movement. So discovered that quite a few Indian law students overlapped quite a bit with the Irish independence movement, to the point that they were ambulance drivers in the Easter Rising, Indian ambulance drivers who were assisting the cause. Yeah, really, really fascinating. And then a kind of simple shorthand was that Vivi was told to leave because of his Sinn Féin connections. From reading this book, it's a lot more subtle than that. But he definitely was influenced by and other people who he was there with were influenced and closely associated with the revolutionary movement. And of course, the independence movement saw a lot of kinship with India, having been through such completely different countries, having been through some very, very similar colonial struggles.
I mean, all the while Irishmen were helping to run the empire, Irishmen were also helping, to fight for Indian freedom, because especially in New York, there was lots of fundraising done by Irishmen in New York for the Indian National Congress and for the Indian cause. And I don't know, John, whether you've read, and if you haven't, I'll send it on to you. I'll send you the link. A speech that Valera made in New York, in support of Indian freedom. It's an amazing speech. And if you haven't seen it, I'll send it on to you. So it's such a strange relationship, isn't it? There was one group of Irishmen, sort of supporting, actively raising funds for Indian independence, and then there was another whole group that were, just running the empire. They were the second rung, running the empire for the English. So, but it was circumstances. I mean, I have read extensively, and I'm not a historian. I'm not even an amateur historian. I'm only a novelist who has used historians' research to help me write my book. And I definitely felt that Irish people had not many options to make a living. And that's what drove them to the empire.
I think that's fair. And, we had actually in our last podcast, we had a gentleman called Finn Dwyer, who has a podcast called Irish History Podcast. And he kind of made the point what's unique about Irish history is that Ireland was the first colony of England.
Yeah, yeah.
And India was its biggest and most prized colony,
Yeah.
I would say.
Yeah.
And so both peoples were subjected to colonial rule. And there are a lot of kind of interesting similarities that jump out. So India becomes independent in 1947 or 49, I forget.
47.
And the country subsequently is partitioned because of religious differences.
Yeah.
Does that sound familiar to you?
Yeah, I know.
Do you think of it in those terms, like how both these countries in some respects are similar, even though they're so very different at the same time?
Oh, absolutely. That when people ask about the religious strife in India, I always quote the religious divide in Ireland between the Catholics and the Protestants, and it's amazing how it's not just it's not, and I don't want to be, I'm not English bashing here, but it is a fact that wherever they went, wherever their empire went, they left, when they left it in tatters. They left it they left it with so many problems. Like, I mean, even if you look at all the colonial powers in Africa, to have left dividing, African nations by straight lines. I mean, there's so many. If you look at a map of the continent of Africa, so many of the countries are straight lines. I mean, how could a continent of tribes, ever be divided by straight lines? And now, and look at all the problems that we have now in with the civil wars in Africa. They're a result of the way nations were divided by the colonial powers.
Let's just talk a little bit about bigotry.
Mm-hmm.
Your book, the characters in your book are all, to some degree or other, bigoted.
Bigoted, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
For example, the priest, Father Jerome, who in many respects comes across as a very kind-hearted man, is virulently bigoted when he talks about Anglo-Indians.
Yeah.
And so this kind of, obviously in all sorts of societies, we actually see bigotry playing out in different ways. And I'm mindful that, unfortunately, we're 30 years after the ending area of your book, but we see bigotry being played out in England, in Ireland to a lesser degree, I think, but it is there. There are certain kind of right-wing types that would not be welcoming of people of color within the country. And certainly, I do believe that part of the reason that Brexit took place had a lot to do with bigotry as well. And indeed, in India, with the Hindu nationalism, we see this kind of toxic bigotry playing out.
Yeah.
I wonder what your thoughts are on that as a person, let's say, that's a minority living within Ireland. How do you even speak to that?
Yeah, it's actually, I'm just full of despair. I'm sorry to say that. I mean, it's such a negative thing to say, but I am full of despair for India, because when I left India, Martin, in 1987, and people would say to me, oh, where are you from? And if there was ever a conversation, I was so proud to say, oh, it's not just, people would say, oh, it's the biggest democracy in the world. And I said, no, it's not. It's not just the biggest democracy in the world. It's the biggest secular democracy in the world. And that was such a thing to be proud of. What's there to be proud of, the religious Hindutva movement now? There's nothing to be proud of. How could you be proud of being bigoted? And the way I look at it, Martin, is, there are 250 million Muslims in India. Are you telling them that they have no room? Where are they to go? Like, I mean, they're as Indian as anybody else. My father was in the army, and the army had such an amazing tradition of respecting every religion. There are people of every faith in the Indian army, in the Indian armed forces. And, for this whole uh, Hindu fundamentalist movement has destroyed India, has absolutely destroyed India, because they have made out, the majority Hindus are not at any danger from the minority Muslims. The majority Hindus are in danger from upper caste Hindus. The problem in India is caste. It is not any religion. The bogeyman is not religion. The bogeyman is not the Muslim. The bogeyman is the upper caste rich landowner. That's the person who is the bogeyman. So, I just despair that the country has gone down this route, and to just deny that 200 million people are no longer Indian, or even if you question the Hindu fundamentalist government, that you are then accused of being anti-national. I mean, that's ridiculous. India is in such a bad state because of religious fundamentalism.
Yeah, we certainly see some of the same themes sadly playing out in our politics. A common word that we hear as part of our dialogue is somebody's being un-American.
Yeah.
And it depends on the speaker, exactly what that means. But it's certainly speaking to some of the stuff or some of the complexities and challenges now being faced by many democracies. One would hope that we would have, gotten to a better place, and it's disappointing to kind of see things backtrack to some degree. I also kind of get a real sense of your passionate distaste for this.
Totally.
When I hear speaking to somebody so fluently about these topics, I'm wondering, is that going to be fodder for a next project? What's coming up?
Actually, it is, but not the book I'm writing now, because I'm taking a break from India in terms of book writing, and my next book is set in West Cork in the 80s in the Beara Peninsula. Which I'm very familiar with the area. So, we have a home there as well. And, for the last 25 years, we've had a home there. And I know the Beara Peninsula intimately. So I decided I was going to set a book there. And it's a fully Irish book. There's no Indians in it. But my next book after that will, I do want to tackle that subject, because I feel very strongly about it. Now, I know that's not the reason one should write a book of fiction. But I think I will probably weave something of what I feel so strongly about into that book.
Cauvery, we're about to let you go. You've been very patient with us for an extended conversation. I've got two more questions. It seems like we can't move on from talking about the experience of an Indian person or Indians in general in Ireland without mentioning the former Taoiseach, Leo Varadkar. What did that mean? I mean, when you back in Sligo, could you have envisioned, politics aside, could you have envisioned one of your people to an extent up there in the leading role in the government?
Well, I tell you what, John, what made me so proud was not the fact that he was Indian or the fact that he is gay, but the fact that did not matter till after he got elected. So, in Ireland, in the campaign, when he was campaigning, the fact that he was gay, the fact that he was Indian just literally never figured, in the conversation. It figured the day he got elected, the day he became Taoiseach, when the world's media suddenly said, oh my God, Just look what's happening in Catholic Ireland. There is a gay prime minister who's also half Indian. And that's what made me so proud, that in Ireland it did not matter. You know, the story and the kerfuffle happened with the international media afterwards. So I was really proud, that I was so proud. I mean, I remember telling people, isn't it fantastic, that in Ireland it didn't matter at all.
It's remarkable. It felt that way over here too. I had met him briefly before he had that role in the government. It didn't seem to be an issue at that point either.
Yeah.
I'm going to go for my closer here. I'm going to go back to your book, and there was a line where somebody is putting someone else on the spot, as I'm about to do to you, and says, "Tell me in 2 words. 2 words will say it all." So, what are your 2 words on Ireland?
Love it.
Good enough. And then finally, what are your 2 words about appearing on Irish Stew?
Savor it. No, thank you so much for having me. I have really enjoyed this conversation, and I think it's really important. It's important to talk about, this the new Irish. And the whole global Irish. I know that you have that as your tagline on your podcast, on your Twitter feed. It's the global Irish nation, and that's really, really important, because I'm constantly amazed at how such a small country has made such a massive, massive difference in so many parts of the world. And I mean, if you just look at our the Irish presence in the UN peacekeeping. I mean, it's not much spoken about in Ireland, but it's something to be so proud of. Having come from an army background, I'm constantly amazed at how UN peacekeepers, Irish UN peacekeepers, have sacrificed so much their lives. So many lives. Towards a kind of very unknown, not unknown, but it's not really a cause that you can sort of pinpoint. So, Irish people, that's just one example, but, the massive influence of Ireland all over the world is just incredible.
I think the diaspora nation of Ireland, the nature of that has kind of made this country very much outward looking.
Yeah.
Indeed, the great tragedy of Ireland, of course, is the famine. And consequently, so many people left Ireland, and the Irish became kind of more globally connected and more outward looking, maybe than any other country in the world.
Yeah.
But I too want to thank you. But before we do that, we have our Seamus plug. It used to be Seamus plug, but through a slip in my speech, I decided, or one day called it the Seamus plug, and we've adopted that. We're thinking of making a little character, and cartoon style for him.
Stereotypical Irish character.
A Seamus plug for whatever particular thing you would like to plug.
Okay, so what I would like to shamelessly plug are indie bookshops and indie publishers. So please, if you're looking to buy a book, please buy them from indie bookshops, and please look at indie publishers. They're so amazing. They have such fantastic books coming out, really diverse collections from, writers from all over the world. And there's some fantastic writing coming from small publishing houses all over the world. So please buy indie published books, and please buy them at independent bookshops. Support your local bookshop, and that's my plug.
I think that's a really worthy plug. I'd like to thank you for coming on. I think it's a fascinating conversation. I could keep going, but I'd also like to remind our listeners, the book is The Tainted. Get it. When I originally saw the cover, I thought it was going to be a girly book. Let me just give one giveaway. The opening chapter deals with a visit to a brothel. So, this is not a delicate book, but it does have moments of great tragedy, of great delicacy, of great romance, and captures the complexity of the Irish and Indian experience. And I couldn't recommend it strongly enough.
Oh.
And I thank you. And I hope our listeners will get a chance to read The Tainted by Cauvery Madhavan. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Martin, and thank you, John.
And when you visit that independent bookstore, pick up The Tainted.
Thank you.
Well, Martin, Cauvery really took us on a true global Irish conversation. We traced her journey from Chennai, India, to spice-deprived Sligo, and then on to the more cosmopolitan Dublin.
Yeah, I found that whole conversation to be fascinating. And it was interesting. While I was listening, I was reminded of how much Cauvery and I have in common. We were born in different countries. I was born in Ireland, where she lives now. And she was born in India, which I have not lived in, nor visited, unfortunately. But we both see the world in a somewhat similar way, as an outsider, as not actually belonging in either place. And that's good and bad, because we bring a different perspective and a different understanding to the places that we choose to live in. And then when we're in touch with family back at home, we can also give them the benefit of that insight. And I wouldn't exchange it for anything. It is the joy and a little bit of the angst of being an immigrant.
And being that kind of hyphenated person that you often mention, Martin. And she got into some fascinating stuff in The Tainted, where the people coming over as soldiers and civil servants and traders were, well, at home, they would have been Irish or Anglo-Irish. When they got to India, they were Anglos. And out of those people who arrived as part of the British occupation, another caste emerged, the Anglo-Indians. Never Anglo enough, never Indian enough. And many of them actually trace their roots to Ireland, Wales, or Scotland.
Yeah, I think it's, in many respects, a little known story. And I think Irish people, to some degree, I know I certainly was, would be surprised at the number of intersections between India and Ireland. Ireland was England's first colony. India, in many respects, was England's most valuable colony. And of course, we did talk about Indian students carving out or going to Ireland in pursuit of academic credentials and actually being involved in 1916 Rising.
Yeah, there's an influx of Indian law students, and they basically found a less racist reception when they got to Dublin. And among those who arrived before the 1916 Rising was V.V. Geary, who would go on to become the president of India. And Geary and the other law students were very naturally gravitating towards the revolutionary politics in Dublin at the time, right down to the fact that some of them drove ambulances for the rebels during the Easter Rising. And this interview gave me a chance to learn about this chapter of history through a great book that Rory Power of Enterprise Ireland lent to me.
Yeah, and speaking of books, of course, what we also want to remind our listeners to make sure that they go out and get themselves a copy of Cauvery Madhavan's The Tainted. It's a quality novel. It's published by Hope Road, and I can't recommend it strongly enough.
Yeah, it's really an epic spanning several generations and compelling all the way through. And it paints a great picture of a world we don't know too much about. And we learned a little bit more about that world because Cauvery gave us a chance to explore some Indian Irish music. We sampled earlier in the show Indian musician and virtuoso of the veena, a kind of sitar-like instrument, Nirmala Rajasekar, who, like Cauvery, is from Chennai. And she actually gave us permission to use her cross-cultural recording from her album Bay 3, The Music of Friendship. We're going to wrap up this episode with an Irish-Indian fusion piece, Nirmala Rajasekar's version of Mary O'Neill, Caroline's favorite jig.
Irish Stew is produced by John Lee, Martin Nutty, and Bill Schultz. Editing, mixing, and mastering by Bill Schultz. Music on Irish Stew was composed and performed by Rosa Nutty, with Donald Bowens on drums, Cathal O'Riordan on bass and synthesizer. For more on Rosa Nutty's music, please visit rosanutty.com.